They had numbers. They had discipline. They had training refined by years of war. And none of it mattered when the ground began to shake. At first, it was barely noticeable, a vibration beneath the feet, a sound too low to be understood, more felt than heard. No horn signaled danger, no scout brought warning, no commander gave the order to brace. And yet, in that moment, something ancient awakened in the human mind: fear. Because panic does not announce itself. It spreads, quietly, relentlessly. Panic turned a disciplined army into a fleeing crowd. But to understand how that happened, how thousands of trained soldiers were undone, we need to go back to the beginning, to the army that believed it was ready for anything. They were not inexperienced men. This army had marched across harsh terrain, survived hunger, exhaustion, and previous battles. Their formations were drilled until movement became instinct. Every soldier knew his place. Every officer knew the plan. They believed in order, in structure, in the idea that discipline could overcome chaos. And for most of human history, they were right. Discipline breaks mobs. Discipline withstands fear. Discipline turns individuals into a weapon. This army had all of it: tightly packed infantry, clear chains of command, weapons designed to kill efficiently and repeatedly. They had faced cavalry charges before. They had faced arrows raining from the sky. They had even faced enemies who outnumbered them. And each time, they held. Because when men stand shoulder to shoulder, fear has nowhere to grow. Or so they believed. The commanders were confident. From their vantage point, the battlefield looked predictable. The enemy was known. The terrain was familiar. The plan was simple: advance, hold formation, crush resistance. Nothing about this day suggested catastrophe. No strange omens. No desperate improvisation. No reason to think history would remember this battle at all. It was supposed to be routine. But wars are not decided by what armies prepare for. They are decided by what armies fail to imagine. Far from the front lines, beyond the sight of most soldiers, something was moving. Not quickly, not urgently, deliberately. Each step pressed immense weight into the earth. Each movement carried a force no formation had ever trained against. Some soldiers felt it before they saw it. A strange unease, a tightening in the chest. Horses became restless. They stamped, snorted, refused commands. Veterans noticed this and frowned. Animals often sense danger before men do. Still, no orders were given. The line held. This army had been taught to fear weapons, blades, arrows, fire. They had never been taught to fear mass. They had never been taught what happens when the battlefield itself seems to move toward you. Because there are enemies you can fight, and enemies your mind rejects as impossible. And somewhere between disbelief and realization, discipline begins to crack. Not all at once, just enough. The first sound was mistaken for thunder, a distant, rolling echo carried by the ground rather than the air. Then came the silhouette, large, unmistakable, wrong. Some soldiers laughed nervously, others stared in silence. No one moved, because no one had been told to. And that hesitation, that single breath of uncertainty, was all it took. What they were about to face was not a new invention. It was not magic. It was not even rare in some parts of the world. But to this army, on this field, in this moment, it was something their discipline had no answer for. And there was more than one. Panic turned a disciplined army into a fleeing crowd, and the ground had only just begun to shake. For most soldiers on that field, what they were seeing did not immediately register as a weapon. Weapons were forged, sharpened, held in human hands. This was something else. It breathed. It moved with intention, and it did not hurry. The animal advanced without fear, because it had never learned what fear was supposed to mean on a battlefield. War elephants were not fast like cavalry. They did not strike from a distance like archers. They did not rely on precision. They relied on inevitability. Once an elephant began to move forward, very little could convince it to stop. The idea of using elephants in war was ancient. Commanders who understood them did not see them as beasts. They saw them as forces, living battering rams, walking fortresses of muscle and bone. An adult war elephant could weigh over 6 tons. Its skin was thick enough to resist shallow blades. Its tusks were weapons capable of lifting, impaling, and throwing a man aside like debris. But none of that was their greatest strength. Their true power was psychological. Men are trained to fight men. Even in chaos, a human enemy is recognizable, predictable, limited. An elephant is none of those things. It does not flinch when struck. It does not scream in pain the way a man does. It does not fall when wounded, not immediately. And when it charges, it does not aim. It collides. Veterans on the battlefield began to understand this too late. They had heard stories, of course, distant campaigns, foreign lands, stories about armies breaking not because they were defeated, but because they lost control of themselves. Those stories always sounded exaggerated. Until now. As the first elephant moved closer, the formation held. Spears were lowered, shields locked together. The soldiers did what they had always been taught to do. But something felt wrong. The animal did not slow. It did not hesitate. It did not respond to the display of discipline in front of it. And suddenly, the men in the front rank understood a terrifying truth. This enemy did not recognize their formation as a threat. The elephant struck the line with sheer mass. Shields shattered. Men were lifted off their feet. The ground disappeared beneath them. Those who were not crushed outright were thrown backward into their own comrades, breaking the structure from within. Discipline depends on space, on alignment, on order, and in seconds, that order was gone. But the collapse did not come from the impact alone. It came from what followed. Behind the first elephant, another shape emerged, then another. Not rushing, not charging wildly, advancing. 3 of them. This was the moment when fear became contagious. Soldiers began to shout warnings that no one had trained to hear. Orders overlapped. Commands contradicted one another. Some men tried to hold the line. Others instinctively stepped back. That single step was enough. Because once a formation bends, it invites collapse. The elephants did not need to kill everyone. They only needed to break cohesion. Once gaps appeared, panic poured through them like water through cracked stone. Men turned their heads, then their shoulders, then their bodies. And when one man runs, another follows. Panic does not ask permission. It does not wait for orders. It spreads faster than any command ever could. The commanders shouted, "Stand your ground! Hold the line! Reform!" But words mean nothing when the mind is overwhelmed. The soldiers were no longer thinking as an army. They were thinking as individuals. And individuals are fragile. Some dropped their weapons to run faster. Others were knocked down by their own retreating comrades. The elephants continued forward, not in pursuit, but in pressure. Every step forward erased another chance to recover control. This was no longer a battle. It was a collapse in progress. And the worst part was yet to come. Because once an army turns its back, the enemy doesn't have to chase. The battlefield itself finishes the job. Panic turned a disciplined army into a fleeing crowd, and the crowd was growing by the second. At first, the retreat was unintentional. No horn sounded, no command was given to fall back. Men simply began to move away from the pressure. One step, then another. Not because they wanted to run, but because standing still no longer felt possible. The elephants did not need to chase. Their presence alone was enough. As the front ranks broke apart, those behind them had no time to understand what was happening. They only saw bodies moving toward them, shields raised in panic, eyes wide, faces drained of color. In disciplined armies, movement is controlled. Here, it was not. The rear ranks were pushed before they could react, and when soldiers collide while facing the wrong direction, formation turns into obstruction. Men stumbled over fallen equipment, over the wounded, over each other. Commands were swallowed by noise, the thunder of footsteps, the screaming of men, the deep, unfamiliar sound of the elephants themselves. No one could tell where the front line was anymore, because there was no front line. Some officers tried to rally small groups. They grabbed shoulders. They shouted names. They pointed back toward the enemy. A few soldiers hesitated, and then they saw it. The elephants were closer now. Their size distorted perspective. What looked distant seconds ago now filled the horizon, and hesitation vanished. Fear works faster than reason. A man does not calculate his chances when 6 tons of muscle closes the distance. He runs. The retreat turned into a surge. Hundreds became thousands. Weapons were dropped, not out of surrender but out of instinct. A shield slows you down. A spear catches on bodies. Survival narrowed to one objective: move. The elephants advanced into the broken mass, not selectively, not tactically. They moved forward because that was their nature. Tusks lifted men from the ground. Bodies were crushed underfoot. Some soldiers were killed instantly. Others were injured and left behind, unheard, unseen, trampled by their own army. The worst deaths did not come from the elephants. They came from panic. When thousands of men try to escape through the same space, space becomes a weapon. Men were pushed into ditches and ravines. They drowned in shallow water. They suffocated beneath layers of armor and bodies. And still, the crowd kept moving. Some tried to turn and fight. They struck at legs they could barely reach. They stabbed at skin too thick to stop the advance. A few blows landed. Some caused pain. But pain does not stop momentum. And momentum was all that mattered now. The elephants did not break formation. The army broke itself. Farther back, soldiers who had not yet seen the animals began to run simply because everyone else was running. They did not know why. They did not need to. Panic had already answered the question. This was the point of no return. Once an army loses the ability to distinguish between danger and rumor, it can no longer be controlled. And control, once lost, cannot be shouted back into existence. The commanders realized it then. This battle could not be salvaged. There would be no counterattack, no regrouping, no heroic stand, only survivors. The elephants continued forward, stepping through what had once been an army. 3 shapes moving through chaos. 3 forces turning movement into destruction. Panic turned a disciplined army into a fleeing crowd, and the crowd was now running for its life. The third elephant did not arrive with speed. It arrived with certainty. By the time it entered the broken field, the army was already unraveling. But what remained could still have scattered, or it could have collapsed entirely. The third elephant ensured the second outcome. Unlike the first impact, this was not shock. It was saturation. There was nowhere left to run that did not already contain fear. The soldiers at the center of the retreat suddenly found themselves trapped. Pressure from behind and something massive closing in from the side. Panic does not just push people forward, it compresses them. Men were forced together so tightly that weapons could not be raised. Shields were useless. Orders were impossible to hear. Breathing became difficult. And in that moment, survival stopped being about escape. It became about space. The third elephant moved through the densest part of the crowd. Every step displaced bodies. Every movement shattered what little order remained. Some men were thrown aside. Others were knocked down and never stood up again. Not because they were weak, but because no human body can stand against that kind of mass. This was when the army ceased to exist, not symbolically, literally. An army requires structure, leadership, and shared intent. What remained had none of those, only individuals reacting to immediate danger. The battlefield itself turned hostile. Dust filled the air, blinding men who were already disoriented. Shouts turned into incoherent noise. Time lost meaning. Some soldiers ran in circles, unable to find an exit. Others collided head-on, each convinced the other was moving the wrong way. No one was in control. The elephants did not pursue the fleeing soldiers beyond the field. They did not need to. The damage had already been done. Once panic reaches critical mass, it sustains itself. Men continued to run long after the immediate threat had passed, long after it was necessary, long after it was rational. The greatest losses occurred after the fighting ended, in the confusion, in the exhaustion, in the desperate attempt to escape faster than the men beside you. Thousands fell without ever seeing the enemy again. Officers tried one last time to restore order. They raised banners, they sounded horns. The signals were seen, they were heard, and they were ignored. Because fear had replaced command. This was not a defeat caused by strategy. It was not the result of inferior weapons or poor planning. It was the collapse of the human nervous system under pressure it was never meant to withstand. 3 elephants did not kill 4,000 men by force alone. They destroyed the idea that the army could survive. And once that belief was gone, the bodies followed. Panic turned a disciplined army into a fleeing crowd, and the crowd left thousands behind. When the noise faded, the battlefield felt unnaturally quiet, not peaceful, empty, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. The elephants were gone now, led away by their handlers. They bore marks of the fight, cuts, embedded weapons, dried blood. But they were alive. The army was not. Bodies covered the ground where formations once stood. Some lay where they had fallen. Others were piled where the retreat had collapsed into itself. Weapons were scattered everywhere, abandoned without ceremony. Shields split, spears bent. Nothing about the field suggested a battle fought to the last man. It looked like a place where order had simply stopped. The counting began slowly. Survivors gathered in small groups, dazed, unable to meet each other's eyes. Officers tried to take names, to rebuild roles, but the lists kept growing shorter. Entire units were missing, not defeated in combat, lost to the chaos. Many of the dead showed no wounds from weapons. They had been trampled, crushed, suffocated. Some had drowned in water shallow enough to stand in, their armor pulling them down as others climbed over their bodies. These men had not lost because they were outmatched. They lost because fear does not allow coordination. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Hundreds, then thousands. By the time the final counts were assembled, the truth was unavoidable. Nearly 4,000 soldiers were gone, not captured, not wounded, dead. 3 elephants still stood. That contrast disturbed everyone who witnessed it. An army erased, and 3 living creatures barely harmed at the center of it. Chroniclers struggled to describe what they had seen. Some blamed poor leadership, others blamed inexperience, but none of those explanations were sufficient. This defeat did not follow the logic of war. It followed the logic of the human mind under extreme stress. Those who survived carried the memory with them, not the image of the elephants, but the sound, the vibration beneath their feet. The moment when confidence turned into uncertainty, and uncertainty turned into terror. The phrase began to spread, quietly at first, then openly. Panic turned a disciplined army into a fleeing crowd. It was not spoken as poetry, it was spoken as warning, because everyone understood what it meant. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The battlefield was eventually cleared, bodies buried, equipment salvaged, but the lesson remained, and it would change the way wars were fought from that moment on. The loss of 4,000 men forced commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. Weapons do not win battles alone. People do. And people break. Until that day, many leaders believed discipline was absolute, that training could override instinct, that formation could overpower fear. The battlefield proved otherwise. No amount of drilling can fully prepare the human mind for something it cannot categorize. The elephants did not defeat the army by killing its soldiers. They defeated it by overwhelming its perception of reality. After this battle, elephants were no longer seen as support units. They became strategic assets. Their role was not to engage, it was to destabilize. Commanders learned that you did not need to destroy an enemy force, you only needed to make it believe it was already destroyed. Tactics began to change. Armies trained specifically to face elephants. They created noise, they dug trenches, they designed weapons not to kill but to scare the animals away. Because once panic begins, stopping it is nearly impossible. The memory of that collapse traveled farther than the battlefield itself. Stories spread between soldiers. Not heroic tales, warnings, about what happens when fear arrives before understanding, about how quickly confidence can evaporate. Future armies learned to watch their animals closely. Horses reacting poorly became an early warning sign. Unusual silence became suspicious. Commanders began to understand that morale was not a background condition. It was a weapon. But the deeper lesson was darker. If fear could break trained soldiers, it could break anyone. Civilians, recruits, veterans. No one was immune. This realization reshaped military thinking. Wars were no longer just about strength or numbers. They were about psychology, about pressure, about timing, about shock. The elephants were only the beginning. Centuries later, the same principle would return in different forms. Explosions instead of footsteps, engines instead of trumpeting. But the result was always the same. Overwhelm the mind, and the body follows. The battlefield where 4,000 died became a case study, not in bravery, in collapse. Because armies are built on discipline, but battles are decided by fear. Long after the battlefield was abandoned, the ground still bore the marks, deep impressions where massive weight had pressed into the earth, scattered equipment half buried in dust, and places where too many bodies had fallen at once. But the most lasting damage was invisible. It lived in memory. Those who survived never spoke about heroism. They spoke about confusion, about the moment when commands stopped making sense, when the world narrowed to noise, movement, and the instinct to escape. They remembered the feeling more than the images, the vibration beneath their feet, the realization that the line was gone, the understanding that discipline had limits. 3 elephants walked away from that field. 4,000 men did not. Not because they were weaker, not because they lacked courage, but because fear arrived faster than reason. History often frames battles as contests of strength. This was not one of them. It was a demonstration of how fragile order can be, how quickly confidence dissolves when the mind encounters something it cannot process. Panic turned a disciplined army into a fleeing crowd. Not slowly, not dramatically, instantly. And that lesson never faded. It followed commanders into future wars. It shaped doctrines, formations, and strategies. Because once you understand how fear works, you stop thinking only about how to kill the enemy. You start thinking about how to break them. Armies are built on discipline, but discipline lives in the mind, and the mind has limits. Sometimes those limits are reached not by weapons, but by something that weighs 6 tons, moves without hesitation, and makes the ground itself feel unstable. That is how 3 war elephants destroyed 4,000 soldiers. Not with strategy, not with speed, but with panic.